from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump heads back into a disaster zone. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as the president and first lady are set to touch down shortly in Kerrville, Texas, to meet with first responders who are in some cases still searching for the missing. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz here in Washington. Kailey, this will not be the first time the president has had this particular duty. He waited days so as to not interrupt with what's happening on the ground there. It's still a lot of questions about the recovery effort that's underway.
Yeah, keeping in mind that there are roughly 170 people still missing that are being searched for. And of course, the president's visit is, we expect him to meet with state and local officials, do a roundtable with them later on this afternoon, comes at a time where those very same local officials are under some scrutiny as to whether or not enough notice was given to those in these areas before the severe flooding came in. A lot of questions, of course, accompany this visit, including whether or not the president is going to change his stance when it comes to the future of FEMA, which is currently on the ground in Texas, helping the state with the aftermath here.
It's a great point you make, and it does seem to be an administration that's changing its tune slightly on that. I suspect we'll hear from the president on FEMA if he's asked today. And as far as enhancements when it comes to safety and warning, there is a special legislative session coming up in Texas, and there's a call by the governor now to install flood alarms along with other systems in that part of the state. Kailey, the president telling NBC News that he would support such a move. We could hear more about that when they are on the ground. They're due to arrive any time now in Texas.
Yeah, and speaking of what the president said to NBC News, he also suggested in that interview that he could be lifting global tariffs on our trading partners to the ballpark of 15 to 20%, up from the current 10% baseline, as he's floating now a 35% tariff on Canadian imports effective August 1st. So we'll get the latest on trade as well this hour. But we begin, as always, with a check on the market. So for those, let's turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. Right now, we do have the S&P, the Dow. They're both trading negative, but NASDAQ just turning higher right now, briefly back in the green. Little changed, up by just about half a point. The S&P 500 index down 17, now down 0.3%. Stocks slipping from records as President Trump intensifies his trade offensive. The Dow down 305, now down 0.7%. But again, keeping it all in context, S&P down by 0.8%. NASDAQ back in the red right now, little change, down a point. 10-year yield at 4.41%, with a 2-year that's currently yielding 3.89%. Gold is up $28 the ounce. Spot gold $33.52, up 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.5%. $68.27 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin, big story there. Another record, surging 3.4% with a $117,000 handle right now on Bitcoin. Earnings coming up next week. Banks will be front and center. All kicks off on Tuesday. Yes, complete coverage on Bloomberg television and radio. JP Morgan Chase among the first out of the gate, down 0.5% right now. Citigroup also reporting Tuesday, down 0.6%. Wells Fargo right now down by 0.1%. So again, recapping tariffs front and center on this Friday. S&P down 16, down 0.3%. And Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, many thanks as ever. We'll get back to Charlie a bit later on this hour to check on the Friday trade. Sliding our way into the weekend here on Wall Street. Some of that, as Charlie mentions, has to do with tariffs. We're going to get to that in a moment as President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump make their way to Texas. This is going to occupy a good part of the afternoon here as we follow the president on his travels. He'll be meeting with first responders and others impacted by the terrible and deadly flooding of last weekend. It has been still less than a week since this occurred. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall brings us up to date on the president's travels today. She's live on the North Lawn at the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe, we are expecting President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump to touch down any moment now, really, in Texas, as they're going to tour this damage and then also, as you mentioned, hold this roundtable with first responders and local officials, as the latest estimates confirm that at least 120 people have died because of the tragic floodings, and 170 people are believed to still be missing. The White House is really billing this as showing solidarity between the federal and the state government when it comes to the response and the assistance that we are seeing on the ground. For example, example, we are expecting the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to be there alongside Texas Governor Greg Abbott and the 2 Republican senators that represent the state in Congress, Senator Ted Cruz and Senator John Cornyn. Of course, as you were discussing at the top of the program, it does come against a backdrop about questions around the future of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, considering that the administration has previously suggested overhauling it or abolishing it completely through some sort of executive order or action, often aligning that view with this idea that this would be a way to streamline government and give power back to the states when it does come to the immediate response to these disasters. Now, there was a report from the Washington Post earlier today that is reporting the administration is moving away from plans to abolish the agency through any sort of executive action. Instead, their reporting indicates that this is going to be built more as a rebranding, in their words, to give more of a highlight to the state response and how officials are going to respond to natural disasters on the ground there. The White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was asked about the future of FEMA earlier in the week, and she didn't give any firm answer, but she did say that the administration will work to ensure that Americans receive assistance, whether that be state or federal assistance, wherever it is needed. We should say, of course, as you both know, FEMA has really been a chronically underfunded agency, something that really has plagued both Republican and Democratic administrations due to a range of issues, including the congressional funding cycle. Joe and Kailey.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And I would note that the president on Air Force One has just touched down. We do have wheels down now. He and the First Lady arriving in Texas. Of course, if we get any remarks from him on route to the damaged area in and around Kerrville, we'll, of course, bring you them live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But when the president was departing, Joe, not only was he talking about the tragedy in Texas, he also, on his way out of D.C., was fielding questions from reporters around his most recent tariff threat issued last night, a letter addressed to Canada and specifically Prime Minister Mark Carney. 35% tariff rate on all Canadian goods is what Canada is now facing, down higher, of course, than the current 25% rate would be effective August 1st. And the reason why, according to the president, is still because of fentanyl. So we want to get into this now with Adam Farrar. He's Bloomberg Economics senior economics analyst. Specifically looking at the Asia Pacific, which, of course, we have trading partners in that region as well who have received letters such as these. But those letters, Adam, were different when we think about what Japan or South Korea, or frankly, most of the other 20-something countries who have received letters got. And he's talked about trade deficits and unfair trade, tariff and non-tariff barriers. With Brazil, it's the treatment of former President Bolsonaro. And with Canada, it's fentanyl. There's a difference with these two most recent letters.
There absolutely is, right? The first simply being that neither Canada nor Brazil was receiving reciprocal tariffs as a threat, right? Mm-hmm. And Canada being one of America's largest trading partners, a USMCA partner, has sat alongside Mexico as kind of a separate discussion since the start of the tariff negotiations and kind of the tariff threats at the beginning of the Trump administration. I think what we've seen so far with this recent letter, which I'll admit caught us slightly by surprise for the aforementioned reasons, is just another potential use of tariff threats as leverage, likely in ongoing negotiations. We've already seen slight escalations over the past couple weeks, with Canada moving out its digital services agreement and prompting the president to threaten even higher tariffs if that wasn't rescinded. And so Canada backed down on that. And so while this letter emerges as an interesting data point, it doesn't really change the conversation. And I think we saw from Prime Minister Mark Carney not a desire to kind of take the bait, right? He had a cautious response, basically arguing that he would defend Canada, but continue negotiations, again, with all eyes on August 1st or whenever really the president decides to follow through with the tariff itself.
Carney had his own self-imposed deadline of July 21 to have a new economic partnership announced with the United States. I guess that's out the window here. This new tariff would kick in August 1st, right? It's actually not in effect yet. So what happens in the meantime? If this is a negotiating tool that would explain the anvil dropping out of the sky with no warning yesterday, Carney gets something less than 35%, and it looks like he got a good deal.
So I'm not sure the Canadians would see it that way. Yeah. But again, taking a step back, the reality is that Canada sits in its own class. The first thing being clear is that the administration, after releasing this letter yesterday, did clarify that goods that receive an exception under USMCA are still exempt, right? And current numbers put the amount of trade that is exempt currently at around 60%. And there's a chance it's going to go even higher with companies looking to find ways in their supply chains to modify a little bit, change some of their inputs, and also just simply do the paperwork to prove that these goods qualify. So Canada has a lot more room there than I think people give them credit for. And the question continues to be, what is the president willing to give and what is Canada willing to accept? The odds of a deal before August 1st will depend entirely on that question, and we simply just don't know. And I don't think the dates themselves matter. It's a question of what the president wants to do.
Well, and of course, the president doesn't just want things from Canada. There's, again, numbers of countries who have received letters such as these. And the president suggesting yesterday that he could be looking at tariffing most of our trading partners at between 15 and 20% when the current baseline is 10. Adam, what difference would that incremental 5 to 10% make if it becomes reality?
So the first thing is, I think when we go back and listen to part of that conversation he had with NBC, it is unclear whether he is laying out a new policy proposal or actually just kind of riffing on the question of what else they're going to do on tariffs. The president has on several occasions, particularly when he's talked about what he's going to do about that long list of remaining countries, thrown out lots of proposals, including the letters that we've started to see. So keeping that in mind and the idea that it's unclear that this is a real change, the reality is, though, that even if he were to roll out 15 or let's just call it 20% tariffs on the remaining countries that haven't received letters so far, the impact, at least on average U.S. reciprocal, the average tariff from the United States is quite marginal because the amount of imports from those countries is relatively small. Now, I would say that Nigeria or other countries that would be impacted, I'm sure would feel otherwise. But at least from the U.S. perspective and broader trade, it would be not as consequential.
Adam, thank you. Great analysis from Adam Farrar, Bloomberg Economics Senior Geoeconomics Analyst. You heard about the tomato tariffs, Kailey?
Yeah, they're coming.
17% Mexican tomatoes starting Monday. So start stockpiling the salsa, I guess. Congresswoman Gwen Moore is watching all of this from her perch in Wisconsin's 4th District. The Democratic Congresswoman is with us right now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to see you, Representative Moore. Welcome back. Are you stockpiling tomatoes ahead of next week? How do we deal with these tariffs?
Well, I tell you, I do have a tomato plant outside my back door, just in case.
You're doing it right, apparently. How concerned are you about the impact this could have on Wisconsin, of course, a major agriculture state, a major dairy state, as we enter a whole new level of trade war, it seems, with Canada?
Well, of course, I'm very concerned. Years ago, I asked my youngest granddaughter where food came from, and she said, pick and save. So I got worried then. You know, the whole food supply chain is going to be disrupted. Everything from farmers planting their foods to actually people who will need and rely on SNAP. And so this will affect grocers, people who have jobs bagging groceries, inflation, the cost of groceries, and our farmers. And the only way that this president seems to be able to address these things is to try to provide a subsidy for agriculture workers, or to declare that he is not going to deport Mexican migrants who might be working as agricultural workers. This is a real big stretch in terms of saving our economy and lowering costs.
Well, Congresswoman, I would mention, and our audience on Bloomberg TV as well as on YouTube can see this now, President Trump has just landed in Texas alongside First Lady Melania Trump. They, of course, are now heading into the helicopter, and they'll begin viewing some of the damaged areas in and around Kerrville, Texas, from last weekend's devastating floods. When we consider, Congresswoman, the future of FEMA, knowing President Trump has up until recently called for essentially its dismantling and sending that responsibility back to the states, do you believe that policy pursuit is one that he will still actively pursue, or could this disaster actually spell a second chance for FEMA as it currently stands?
Well, I guess I wish I could predict what President Trump was going to do, because I would not have predicted that FEMA would have been destroyed when we have seen time and again, whether you believe in climate change or not, the environment be shifty, cause tornadoes, all kinds of 500-year weather conditions. And surprise, surprise, this storm was yet another aggression on the part of Mother Nature and a warning not to dismantle emergency services. I heard President Trump say, I wouldn't have even blamed Joe Biden for this. But I'm telling you that there's nothing like preparedness and nothing like being able to reach people on several different platforms to warn them to escape. And so I think that it's fine for him to be there with his wife. That's where any president should be. And maybe it's better late than never. But I think that the agony and misery of this community is going to continue long after the cameras are gone and long after Air Force One leaves.
Well, it is pretty heartbreaking to consider 170 people still missing, Congresswoman. Texas is one of many states that has seen an influx in ICE raids. Of course, Texas is a border state and is no stranger to immigration security here. But I want to ask you about some of the raids that we have been seeing, in many cases by unmarked and masked individuals who are purportedly with ICE, or sometimes it's hard to tell, Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security. You just signed a letter urging ICE to not deport undocumented victims of crime. Did you hear a response from the federal government, from the administration on this? Is there anything your office can do to help them?
No, the response is hopefully forthcoming. There's nothing more frightening to me than think of someone throwing a bag over my head and dragging me away. This is so un-American to not announce which law enforcement agent you are, demonstrating your badge number and that you have the authority to take people into custody. This is very chilling. And I think it's being done deliberately to replicate the tactics of authoritarian regimes. This is totally unacceptable, and it defies people's, I'm not an attorney, but I would think that if you need a warrant, you would at least need to disclose who you are as a law enforcement person. This is totally unacceptable.
Well, Congresswoman, when we consider ICE will be getting more funding along with Customs and Border Patrol due to the One Big Beautiful Bill that just passed and all the various components in it, with the passage of that bill, with the potential passage of now a rescissions package that could very well happen in the Senate, do Democrats have any incentive to deal with Republicans for a government funding deal?
Well, we always have an incentive to do our job if we're allowed to do our job. You know, the thing about the package now is that it's the largest border bill that we have seen in history. And I don't know that it's always directed at the right equipment. Democrats have long been for more electronic surveillance, more human beings to actually evaluate and separate the sheep from the goat, as it were, at the border. We have always erred on the side of more border security, but the building the optics of, putting people, surrounding them by alligators. This is costly. It costs so much money to, the optics. Like Alcatraz, for example, it costs more money than it's worth in terms of incarcerating people. I think that the overkill is not only bad for people's personal rights, but for our budget.
All right, Congresswoman, we appreciate your time. As always, Democratic Congresswoman Gwen Moore, representing Wisconsin's 4th District, here with us on Balance of Power. And we'll have much more still ahead as we assemble our political panel next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will be with us to talk more about that rescissions package I was alluding to. Unclear if it'll pass in the Senate, and if it does, what consequence that may have. That conversation still ahead right here on the Friday edition on Bloomberg TV and radio. The markets, of course, reacting in part to one true social post we've gotten from the president in the last 24 hours, of course, threatening higher tariffs on Canada, specifically of 35%. But, of course, his musings on social media have not stopped there, as he also issued a warning to Republicans on Capitol Hill. saying in True Social, it is very important that all Republicans adhere to my rescissions bill. Remember, this is a $9 billion package intended to claw back funding that Congress had already agreed to spend. He says, quote, in particular, defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS and NPR, which is worse than CNN and MSDNC put together. Goes on to say, any Republican that votes to allow this monstrosity to continue broadcasting will not have my support or endorsement. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And Joe, a threat to not support those who do not vote for this really puts a focus on some Senate Republicans who have indicated they aren't super comfortable voting for this package.
As we've suggested more than once, the likes of Mike Rounds, other Republicans who are in rural areas are concerned that a lifeline for emergency information and news could go away here. A lot of these stations do, in some cases, carry material from National Public Radio, which is what they're talking about, but they also have homegrown newsrooms. And after what we're seeing today with the president touring this disaster area in Texas, it does make you wonder if it's worth eliminating them. But this is an easy target, and we talk about defunding NPR and PBS on the regular. The question is, will Democrats be on board? Probably not. Republicans may not be either, though, which is where you're going.
Yeah, but to your point on Democrats, if Republicans ultimately can get enough votes together in order to pass this rescissions package, it could very well complicate efforts to reach an appropriations deal, which is going to require bipartisan compromise. You need Democrats to go along in the U.S. Senate. And the question many Democrats are asking is, why would we do so if you might just recant on the deal and claw back the funding later? Let's
see where the panel's thinking is on this right now as we assemble our panel for this Friday edition. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick and Jeanne, you're more than familiar with this debate, and we've been getting to this the last couple of days. I just wonder, Rick, at this point, is $9.4 billion worth blowing up a budget deal on, realizing that we've got a fiscal year starting on September 30th? Is it worth it for John Thune to go through with this?
Yeah, look, I think this is all in the context of a much bigger issue. No, $9.4 billion is a nothing burger in government. But this was specifically put together, this package, to highlight, as you pointed out earlier, issues like NPR that Republicans like to rail against. So it's kind of the best possible package of its size. But this is all about the executive branch taking control of the budget that is normally held in Congress. Kailey was right. 60 votes to pass an appropriations budget, right? One that the government that Congress has been forced to do in a bipartisan way to get to those 60 votes. But then to do these rescissions, it only takes 51 votes, or even 50 with the vice president voting a break a tie. So the president's trying to basically reset that clock and say, you know what, you can do all you want to do on a budget bill, but I'm then going to take just Republicans and skinny it down. We used to call this a balanced budget amendment, right? Where we would say the president should be able to strike things. And that's, in essence, what he's trying to do. So he can get rid of the same issues that the Congress has had to grapple with 50 votes that they've required 60. And that is more about Democrats and Republicans, because Democrats have to go along if they want to get a budget bill for Congress for the federal budget, but then they can be cut out in the process of doing these rescission bills. And so they see flashing red lights, all related to this little $9 billion time bomb sitting in Congress.
So then what are Democrats to do, Jeanne?
Well, Rick is right. This is very much akin to what we used to have, which was the line item veto. That was taken away. The Supreme Court said it is unconstitutional. And this is another way to get to the same end. And it is putting Democrats in a very, very difficult position. Number one, when Chuck Schumer went along last year or several months ago with helping the Republicans keep the government open, he was lambasted for that. Their base under no circumstances wants them to aid and abet, as they see it, Republicans in anything they're doing. And so that is going to be pushing on them very, very hard. And on the other hand, this is a party and many members who have always said, don't allow a government shutdown. It's not good politics or good policy. And of course, what does it say to Democrats that they vote for something that can then in just a few months be clawed back in this manner? And particularly things that are near and dear to them, like, and many of us, like public broadcasting or PEPFAR. So it's a very difficult position for Democrats to be in. And I would just add, with the president down in Texas at this very minute, does any of that reality change his view on this longstanding commitment from Project 2025 and elsewhere about rural communication as it pertains to public media? I hope it does. I will be curious to see what he says after touring that devastated area.
Yeah, same here, Jeanne. It's a great point. Although I'll tell you, I mean, this is something that goes around Republicans and Democrats. Rick, the line item veto. Remember, this was something that Bill Clinton used to talk about all the time. Does it take Donald Trump to bring it back?
I think this is basically the line item veto in absentia, right? Republicans, too. John McCain was a big fan of line item veto. Supreme Court says you can't do it, and at least not the way it was constructed when we tried to pass laws around it. And so what this basically does is give the president a line item veto. And yet all he needs in this case is Republicans to give it to him when he passes that back as a rescissions package. And remember, this is $9 billion of $150 billion worth of rescissions that they have loaded up in Stephen Miller and Russ Vought's gun in the White House, ready to punch through the minute they get a green light that something like this can pass. Even the White House didn't give this much credibility to say, there's no way Congress is going to let us do this because it takes away their authority. And yet we are only a week away from seeing the United States Senate either do nothing and kill the bill or pass this and give the White House basically control over the budget process.
Well, Rick, I'm glad you mentioned Russ Vought because he, of course, gave an extensive interview on another network earlier today, in part talking about this rescissions package and the desire to defund things like PBS. But he also talked about an investigation the OMB is now opening into specifically the Federal Reserve and Chairman Jerome Powell over the cost of the remodel of the Fed building here in Washington. This is what he said.
This is about the renovations that are occurring, the extent to which they are largesse. The cost that we're talking about is now $2.5 billion. If you look at the actual Palace of Versailles, if you were to update those figures for where we, in modern numbers, it would be $3 billion. The Capitol was about $2.5 billion.
Actually making those comments to reporters outside the North Lawn of the White House. But Jeanne, as we consider this kind of investigation into the cost of the renovation, into the chair of the Federal Reserve, which I would keep in mind, Pulte of the FHFA has also called for, and the Judiciary Chair of the House, Jim Jordan, suggested to Joe and I earlier, just about a week ago, that he would be considering a congressional investigation as well, or at least looking at that. Is that the way to put the pressure on the chair of the Federal Reserve, who the president at this point has said he's not going to outright fire, but just a different way to make life uncomfortable as he pushes for lower rates?
Yeah, I never considered the Fed chair a Palace of Versailles guy myself. Listening to Russ Vought, he said this many times. I think what we're seeing is an extension of the attacks that the president has been making against the Fed chair for a long time. We know that he has this nickname for him. We know he would like to remove him. He has said he won't do that early, likely because of the impact on the market. And what we're seeing, I think, is a real concerted move forward on that, with other members of the administration going on the attack in other ways. And Russ Vought is a good example of this. It does put pressure on the chair, whether that pressure amounts to anything, whether we see him change his mind or take different actions, or whether they are angling to see if there is indeed a way to get him out early, which is what the president would like. And we know there's nothing that Russ Vought and many members of this administration want to do more than please the president. And at this point, I would say removal of Jerome Powell is one thing that would really excite Donald Trump. And I think we're seeing people angling for a way to do that. And this is one way.
It's hard to tell exactly what's going on inside that building, Rick. Russ Vought said in a letter to the Fed chair that there were plans for the project, including rooftop terrace gardens, VIP private dining rooms and elevators, water features, premium marble, and much more. Sounds pretty nice. Powell, in recent testimony, responded to this. He said there's no VIP dining room, there's no new marble, there are no special elevators, no new water features. He said there's no beehives, no roof terrace gardens. I have to admit, this sounds like something that would be on brand for the Trump White House. The president just a couple of days ago was pointing out all the new gilding that went into the Oval Office and the cabinet room. What seems to be the problem with this?
Yeah, hard to imagine that anybody from this White House would complain about the sprucing up of a federal building. Look, this is all just an effort to try and jam the chairman. And look, my mama always taught me you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And I guess I got a different mama than Donald Trump, because he has made it harder for him to get a cut in the discount rate than or the interest rates than he otherwise would have had if he'd done nothing. He's making it almost impossible for the chairman of the Fed to lower rates because it looks like a capitulation. Give him a day off.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Is that a veiled reference back to the bees that do or do not?
That was pretty good.
Exist,
yeah.
Honey.
Maybe they need a beehive on the roof.
Our political panel here on Balance of Power on this Friday. Thank you so much. We'll be back for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Joe, Mathieu, and myself are monitoring the activity in Kerrville, Texas, where, of course, President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump are visiting today in the aftermath of the devastating floods that have claimed at least 120 lives. We're going to check in with our colleague, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, in just a moment. But we also wanted to focus on a subject area the president actually spoke about with reporters before departing Washington for Texas. He was talking about immigration, Joe. And a direct quote from the president in his remarks this morning: "We're getting the criminals out, and we're getting them out fast." Now, as we know, a lot of the people who have been arrested as part of these efforts in the administration to arrest and deport people do not necessarily have criminal records. And also their means at getting to these people have frequently been to raid workplaces.
That's true. And this has been a byproduct of Stephen Miller's urging of ICE and immigration officials to increase the number of detentions per week, per month, that are still running below what we saw in the Biden and Obama administrations. There was a big raid yesterday, Kailey, California, in which tear gas was sprayed at protesters. They were going after a cannabis grow facility, I guess, in Southern California. Footage taken that we've taken a look at show them executing criminal search warrants. They say they got 10 juveniles, 8 of them unaccompanied, found at one of the facilities raided, that all of them were in the country illegally. When we talk about these raids, we discussed this earlier on the hour with Congresswoman Gwen Moore. In many cases, these agents are masked and are wearing plain clothes, making it very confusing for the people who are there. You see a call on social media, citizens come protect the immigrants who are being targeted, and things get pretty ugly pretty quick. And it's part of the conversation that we wanted to have with Wendy Edelberg, who's a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, former chief economist, incidentally, at the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. We could talk about a couple of things here with Wendy. Welcome. It's good to see you as we consider the impact that this policy is having on our workforce and our economy. When you hear stories like this, the chill could go much further than the people who were at that site. What does that mean for workers?
Absolutely. I mean, so let me first say, I'm coming at this as an economist. That's my lane.
Understood.
So I'll talk about the economic effects, but I think those are dwarfed by just the visceral effect as an American looking at these images. I think that effect is far more important and far bigger than I think what's going to sound like pretty modest economic effects that I'm about to discuss. So with some colleagues, we put out a report not so long ago where we think that it's more than likely that as a result of this immigration policy, we will have negative net migration, which is to say more people leaving the country than entering the country this year for the first time in many decades. And that's going to mean a smaller economy, and that's going to mean a labor market with numbers that are going to be not so recognizable, really startling labor market numbers as we go forward.
Well, and we've seen that in the past several jobs reports when we're thinking of the share of the foreign-born workforce. That number is going down, and it's going down substantially, raising the question of who replaces those workers. Wendy, who does, who can, who's willing to?
So let's first step back a bit and talk about what's probably happening in the labor market right now. So I appreciate that the published statistics are showing things about, share of foreign born and the like. Those statistics, while, I don't mean to impugn them at all, these are large changes that are happening right now, and those statistics are probably not fully catching up with what's happening. My guess, my analysis suggests that the surge in immigration over the past few years is actually still pushing up labor supply. And the reason I say that is because there's a big swath of immigrants that are new to this country that are eligible to apply for work permits. And we have seen a surge in those work permit applications. And while approval rates are down, like, for example, between April and May, this administration approved almost 700,000 work permits for recent immigrants. And so I think one of the reasons that we've seen such strong employment numbers over the past few months, on average 150,000, I think that is because labor supply is still being pushed up by the recent surge in immigration, but we can't ride that wave forever, and we're probably just about at the moment that increase in labor supply comes to an end, and we start seeing payroll employment numbers that are closer to like 30,000 a month.
Really?
10,000 a month. In a year or so, we could start seeing payroll employment numbers that are negative, and that will be like a healthy, sustainable, full employment labor market, just with declining labor supply and so declining employment.
So what does that mean for participation and the unemployment rate?
So there's going to be some near-term gyrations.
A year from now, though, to your point, if we're in a negative growth on payrolls, what's the rest of the job market look like?
So I think the rest of this is going to be the cognitive dissonance, the thing that's going to be really hard about understanding the labor market that this policy has created. It could well be that we have a healthy labor market, an unemployment rate that starts with a 4.
Starts with a 4.
Starts with a 4. It could be a nice, healthy labor market, but just we have a shrinking labor supply, and that just means shrinking employment. There are other economies.
Are wages through the roof in that world?
For a time, I think that there will be near-term gyrations. We're going to see stronger wage growth in some occupations, stronger wage growth in the agricultural sector, stronger wage growth for home health workers. But I think other parts of the economy, and particularly some cities, some areas, are actually going to see big reductions in consumer demand. We're already seeing this in some areas where we're seeing, big raids on immigrant communities. And businesses there are complaining that they're seeing much less demand for their products. Those businesses are going to lower their prices. They're going to lay off workers, and you're going to have deflationary effects.
I want to focus on the labor supply issue you're referring to, because we know there are people on the sidelines in this. That's why we don't have a full labor market participation. The Ag Secretary, Brooke Rollins, suggested in an interview this week that if you take the agricultural sector, for example, and the workforce that may be lost by migrants, that there are people who could replace those workers, people who need to work in order to be eligible for Medicaid. Do you expect that actually is a dynamic that will take place, that kind of changes to how you're able to access Medicaid could bring people off the sidelines?
So it's the theory of the case. I mean, I'll say there's a lot of economic analysis that suggests that if you make people poor enough and desperate enough, they will work. So I get it. If we decimate the safety net, we will increase labor supply. I don't know that it will happen nearly enough to replace the, hundreds of thousands of immigrants that we're talking about no longer being in this country or not coming. And I'll also say one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that this will be a huge effect is that the labor market has been quite strong for some time. And it has been a pretty good time to get a job. And we've seen stronger labor force participation among some groups, but not those groups have actually largely been women who have increased their labor force participation rates. There's some excellent work coming out of the Hamilton Project at Brookings showing that labor force participation among women has been particularly strong. Even this strong labor market has not been enough to get these prime age men off the sidelines. So I'm not sure that incrementally stronger wage growth is going to have some cataclysmic effect. But yes, if you make people desperate enough, they will work.
All right, Wendy, really great to have you. Appreciate the conversation. Wendy Edelberg, Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution and former Chief Economist at the Congressional Budget Office, here with us in Washington. Much appreciate the time. Of course, no longer in Washington, at least for the remainder of the afternoon, is President Trump, who departed Washington earlier today and has actually just touched down via Marine One after Air Force One landed in Texas earlier in Kerrville, Texas, where he will be surveying some of the damage in areas affected by last week's devastating flooding. And of course, we'll be meeting with state and local officials participating in a roundtable this afternoon in the aftermath of this tragedy, with more than 170 people still unaccounted for. We want to get the latest and turn to our Texas bureau chief. Bloomberg's Julie Fine is joining us from Dallas. So, Julie, just walk us through, if you could, what we expect to see from President Trump's visit this afternoon.
Well, you already saw him with the governor, with the senators, clearly trying to show unity in this situation. Now he'll sit down with a roundtable and he's going to get a briefing, and he's really going to learn firsthand. I mean, he's gotten the briefings at the White House. He's gotten the briefings from FEMA. He's gotten all these briefings, but he's going to really sit down and get a real look into what's happening in Texas and what's going to happen for a long time forward. This cleanup should take a very, very long time. A disaster declaration was declared for several surrounding counties today as well. He's going to really see the work ahead. Then he will go and actually tour the damaged site, which, you know, the media's been through now. You've seen it from the air as well. It's devastating. You will see cabins. You will see really debris that a human being is very hard to fathom. So that's what's ahead today.
You wonder exactly how that's going to affect the president and the first lady, for that matter, when they see it, Julie. There has been a call for flood alarms to be put in this area. It's not the first time we've heard this, but Governor Abbott, who I know you're in contact with, is calling for this to be adopted during a special legislative session. President Trump telling NBC News he supports that. Will it happen?
I think it will happen in this session. I mean, I think there will be a little back and forth with the details involved with it and the actual funding of it. But when you have the governor and the lieutenant governor on record saying we are going to get this done, you have lawmakers in just about a week now, it will be very difficult for them not to take some very serious action in the aftermath of this.
Well, and when we consider the aftermath of this and how it's going to inform policy decisions, not just in Texas, but federally going forward, Julie, as we have questions around what the administration's intention is when it comes to FEMA, is there a sense in Texas that this, the aftermath of this could be properly managed by the state alone, or is it necessary that FEMA is on the ground there right now?
Well, I'm certain that they want FEMA here right now. I mean, I saw a local official the other day saying simply anybody that wants to be here that can volunteer and help, we want you here. So certainly FEMA being here is going to help in the aftermath. You have to look at, Joe and Kailey, how much money and support is going to be needed for such a long period of time. I mean, the Hill Country is an extremely popular destination for people in the summer, but there are also people that live there. There's also an economy. It's 55,000 people, so obviously not a huge city, but there's an economy there that is going to need to be rebuilt essentially outside of the city. So FEMA definitely will be needed. I imagine the governor will be reaching out as well. Now, Texas does have a very large response. Sadly, this is a state that's had to really manage quite a few of these type of tornado type rain situations because of the weather here and the topography.
Julie, thank you so much for the great reporting. Our Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine. The president will be there for about 3 hours soon to sit down at a roundtable with first responders. We'll keep tabs on it. We'll have a lot more for you in the late edition of Balance of Power. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern. Alongside Kailey Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.